In this video, we're going to talk about the distinction between dependent and independent variables. This is a very important distinction in research design, but is also very important in statistics in order to properly set up the analyses. So it is useful to understand what these terms actually mean. Let's go back to the fundamental of setting up a research question, which, as we have said, always must concern a relationship among variables. This means that in order to ask a question that can be answered by research, we have to narrow the question down and precisely define everything about measuring the variables that go into this question. So everything has to be cast in terms of variables, their measurement, the context, and the conditions under which they are measured. In general, we usually are interested in what affects some target, some outcome. This target variable is therefore called a dependent variable because by design, by the nature of our question, we are interested in what it depends on or whether it depends on something. This leaves out the things that it might depend on, and therefore all the other variables that are used essentially as predictors for it are called independent variables. So this is just design terminology. By calling a variable independent, we're not really saying that it's independent of anything else. It's one more poor choice of words in statistical terminology. Independent variable means we use it to predict another variable. Dependent variable means this is our outcome of interest and the variable that we are assuming or asking whether it is affected by others. Let's go through some examples to understand this better. So one silly example is to ask the question, does coffee help studying? But this is a very vaguely phrased question. In fact, it's not possible to answer this question because it's not well specified. In order to be able to answer it, we have to define specific variables that we can then measure. And there are many, many options. We're not going to go through many of them, but we'll just see two completely different examples. One possibility is to define one variable as the number of espresso cups per day, and another variable as the number of hours spent reading per day. So essentially, this is like asking, does how many espressos we drink in a day affect how many hours we study in a day? That's what we're asking. And if we put it this way, then this means that the number of espresso cups would be our independent variable, and the number of hours spent reading would be our dependent variable. Now, you might object that this isn't what you're really interested in when you are asking whether coffee helps, but that just means that you're going to have to define your variables differently. And before we go on to another definition, let me remind you that this is still way too vague. We have to specify whom we ask, what they do, what else they might be doing, if they drink any other things, when we measure these, how often, exactly what the observations or questions are, and so on. So this is just the first step in defining variables so that they can be designated as dependent or independent. A different approach to the same general question might be to define a variable as the property of drinking coffee versus drinking soft drinks like Coke or Bruce or what else some people might be drinking. And another variable as the average grade in semester courses. So this might be more interesting for some. These are very different variables. The first variable is actually a grouping variable. It's a persons who drink coffee versus persons who don't drink coffee but drink another category of drinks. And that would be our independent variable, the group. And the dependent variable would be a grade. So we're asking if there are differences in grades between these two groups of people. And we still need to define a whole bunch of other details before you can actually produce an answer to this question by running the measurements and the analyses. So you see that the general question, does coffee help studying, is very far from being answerable. There are many different ways to make it specific enough. And in the process, we have to define specific variables. And one of those variables is going to be our target, and that's our dependent variable that we want to study if it's affected. And the other variable, the predictor, is called the independent one. Let's look at some more examples. So one question might be, does music affect aggression? This is very vague, of course. We can define it in many ways for different groups and for different purposes. So for this illustration, I'm just keeping it very simple. And let's say that one way to define it would be by groups, such that people in one group are asked to listen to K-pop all day, and people in another group listen to anarcho jazz all day, and other people are asked to listen to death metal music all day. And they do that for some time, which is part of what needs to be defined. And then we ask them to fill out an aggression questionnaire. And in this case, the group, which kind of music they are asked to listen to, the group would be our independent variable, and the score on this aggression questionnaire would be our dependent variable. And of course, we would have to define a whole bunch of other things. Another completely different conceptualization of this question would be to note how long each person listens to music per day. And we have to do this we need to define for how many days we want to do this, for 1 day, for a week, for how long, or every Monday, for a year, whatever we decide. And we also at some point need to define some measure of aggression. So another variable might be an aggression assessment checklist in which an observer checks some items. And for example, this can be used with special populations or with children and so on. And we need to define all the conditions for it. In this case, number of hours listening to music would be our independent variable, and the score on the aggression checklist will be our dependent variable. Different examples. A very interesting example in our context is, does intervention for something work? For reading, for emotional difficulties, for behavioral problems, for language, for whatever. For X, does intervention for something work? We need to define variables. One possibility is to have an intervention group and a control group. Then, so the intervention group receives the intervention, the control group is one way to define these is to have an intervention and a control group. The intervention group receives the intervention and the control group is engaged in something else. And after the intervention, after some time of doing this, then both groups are assessed with a test, and we measure their performance. So here the independent variable is group, and the dependent variable is the score or the performance on this assessment test that is a valid instrument for measuring X, whatever it is we want to improve with the intervention. And of course, there's lots of other details that need to be defined in our research design. Another approach to this question is to define a different variable, the variable of time, so that time would have the value before intervention and the value after intervention. And another possibility for the outcome here would be an assessment checklist. So for some things, it may be preferable or only possible to assess the X that we're trying to improve by observation, in which case you'd have to use the checklist. So we define our outcome accordingly. And this means that we basically assess the participants twice, once before the intervention and once after the intervention. So the independent variable is time. And the dependent variable is the score on this assessment checklist. So you see two different design approaches. One is to have an independent variable of group. The other is to have the independent variable of time. And in real research, when we do this properly, we actually use both independent variables. So we have two groups, and we assess both groups before and after for reasons that you're going to learn in the research design part of the course. And some final examples, we can ask for example, are girls better than boys in math? Of course, this needs to be specified, like in what age, what math are we talking about, and so on. But anyway, we can define the variable of sex. This is obviously our independent variable. And the dependent variable could be performance on some math assessment test. For example, the state test, the national assessment on math performance in a given age. Or we can ask something like, are children with dyslexia better in art things? So here we would have a group variable distinguishing children diagnosed with dyslexia from children typically developing in their reading skills. And the two groups would probably have to be matched in some other things. So they should be as similar as possible, except for the dyslexia diagnosis. And that would be our independent variable, the group or the diagnostic category. That's our independent variable. And the dependent variable would be the score on some instrument for assessing artistic skills. And one final example, we could ask, do minority language speakers have poor Norwegian vocabulary? So in that case, again, our independent variable is a grouping variable. It's a group. We would have children with a minority home language in one group and otherwise comparable children with the majority home language. So they would have to be matched in other things, so from the same neighborhoods and circumstances and so on. That would be our independent variable. And our dependent variable would be some score on appropriate vocabulary tests for the age. So I hope this concept is now clear. And please go through more examples yourselves to connect the nature of a research question to the concept of what is the dependent and what is the independent variable.